Alrighty, we are live. This is Working Lunch. My name's James Mulvaney. Today, my guest is going to be Neil Butler from Untypical Media. We are going to be starting today's session in about 1 minute's time, so stay where you are. Go grab yourself a drink, get your notebook ready. We're going to be talking today all about starting, launching, and concepting and growing a podcast or a radio station. We're going to be kicking off today's session in about a minute from now. Welcome to Working Lunch. Today's session starts in 30 seconds, so stay where you are. All right, we're live. My name's James Mulvaney. Welcome to Working Lunch. This is the first session we've done for probably about 2 months now, so it's really good to get back. You know the drill. Every single Wednesday, lunchtime, 1 o'clock, we go live with a different guest. And each time we bring 3 actionable strategies to the table to talk about growing your business, growing your audience, or growing your team. It's really simple. We go broadcast live, and if you've got any questions, we kind of keep it quite chilled, quite casual. But if you have any questions for either myself or my guest, please put them in the comments. They'll be fed back to me, and we'll be doing a Q&A at the end. Now, I want to introduce today's guest. Delighted to have him on board. My guest today is Neil Butler. Now, he's founder of and managing director of Untypical Media, and he runs a podcast called Wow Pod, which I was featured on in my 30 and 30 challenge, and he also runs GoRadio.live as well. So without further ado, Neil, how's it going? Welcome to Working Lunch.
Thanks, James. Great to be here. I can't believe you guys have lunch at this time of the night.
No, exactly.
It's 10 p.m. where I am.
Yeah, so, right. I'm on the water. Yeah, and then we're cheersing on the water and wine. So yeah, firstly, Neil, thanks very much for having me. We kind of met. Well, we're sort of working together on and off for like the last year. I know you have GoRadio.live, which is using radio.co. More recently, you've launched your podcast, which is Words of Wisdom, which you very kindly had me on a couple of months ago when I was doing my 30 and 30 challenge. How's everything been going on that?
Yeah, been really good. I've been inspired with a couple of things that you've done, and I've created my 20 in 2020 challenge, which you were trying to get yourself onto 30 podcasts in 30 days. Yeah. I tried to get 20 guests in 20 days in 2020, hence the 20 in 20 in 2020. Managed to do that. So I've now got a backlog of content, which means I don't need to actually do any more wow podding until September.
All right. So just start off with, just tell us a bit about yourself, your background. How did you get interested in the kind of online broadcasting space, radio, podcasting? Tell us a bit about your journey.
Well, I started in community radio in Australia. It's a part of the radio scene where municipalities were given licenses, broadly speaking, to be able to do amateur broadcasting, and I got accidentally dragged into it by my daughter, who was a presenter. One night, her co-host didn't turn up. She said, "Dad, you better come and have sit in the chair with me." So I did that, and the station manager was listening, and he said, "I think we better get you a program of your own." So I've been presenting on community radio since 2008. In fact, New Year's Eve 2007 was the first program I did. I moved to Geelong, which is about 70 kilometres out of Melbourne, and when I moved down here, got involved in the local community station down here. I also broadcast Australian rules football one level below the AFL, so the National League, one level below that. And I didn't have anywhere to broadcast it when I moved to Geelong. So I thought, well, I'll start my own radio station. And that's when I stumbled over radio.co.
Yep.
In parallel, I've been doing a little bit of podcasting. Everyone's entitled to my opinion. That's what I started off with. So I decided to do that. When podcast.co popped up in my life, I thought, yep, it makes sense to put these two things together. So since then, I had a couple of runs at podcasts and then cancelled a couple. At the moment, I'm involved in 5 podcasts for various reasons in various formats. Yeah.
So juggling a lot of things at once.
Well, at the moment, of course, with Corona going on, I'm not currently in a full-time job. So
yeah.
I've got plenty of spare time on my hands. So I've been able to experiment with a few things.
Yeah. Okay. So this brings us along nicely to our first topic for today: radio versus podcasting. I know you're involved with both, and obviously you've been now doing radio for 10 plus years. What's your take on what the difference is, first of all, between the two mediums, and which one do you prefer if you had to pick one?
It's a little bit like asking which do I prefer, my daughter or my son. Different reasons for different situations.
Yeah.
I think the thing with radio is, by its nature, it really needs to be 24/7 and ongoing. That's really where it was really my challenge when I started GoRadio.live. I had 7 hours of content every week for 6 months of the year when the football season was on. So what do you do with the rest of it? I'm paying you $1 squillion a month. No, not that much. I'm paying you for the right to have a facility to broadcast. Why not use it? So in effect, you're forced into 24/7 programming. And then if you're going to do that, and if you're doing it by yourself particularly, the ideal is to use music. And then, of course, other costs come into it associated with licensing. Podcasting is great because you only need to turn out half an hour, maybe a week, and you still have an audience, but they can choose to listen when they want to listen rather than choosing to, I'm just going to switch it on and something's going to be there.
Yeah. But then again, I guess one of the downsides to podcasting is you can't really use music. There's been a lot of problems in terms of most of the record labels sort of basically see podcasts as a taboo. They think, well, we don't want people downloading our tracks illegally, etc. So it's still quite hard to get a license for a podcast, and it's quite easy to get licensing for radio, I think. So there's kind of, my advice to kind of people who ask us, should I start a podcast or a radio station? Well, if you're looking to do music, you should really look into radio because it's a live format and it's much easier to get a license. Again, I think a lot of the licensing authorities have got frameworks already for smaller stations. It doesn't always have to cost an arm and a leg. And it's just like buying something online. You just sign up for a license and off you go. But I think I agree with you in terms of actually the time it takes to produce content. If you want to roll out a format that's really engaging on radio, you need to make sure you've at least kind of got the daytime covered. You can't really just have like one show a day and then play just endless music. I think there needs to be a bit more substance to it than that. So what would be your advice to kind of creating content for radio? How do you actually make sure that you're filling that schedule up when it's just you on your own sort of running it?
Yeah, and I do actually sleep occasionally.
Yeah.
So I think that the default that I've taken is the music. For starters, I've chosen a genre. And the genre that I've chosen is, we work on the basis it's the very best music of the last 70 years. Now, you'll probably be able to tell by looking at the pictures of us, I'm a little older than you are. So in my mind, the very best music of the last 70 years were in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. So we've limited it to that. And those so-called gold stations that every country's got, they tend to play, if you're going to play a Beatles track, you always play Hey Jude, or you play, Let It Be. You don't play the full catalogue. And so what I decided to do was to say, I'm going to break this up into sections. So rather than just having 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the same stuff churning out, using, and this is not a paid advertisement for radio.co, but one of the things that's great about radio.co is the ability to tag music. And so I have a program at 6 in the morning and 6 at night called 60s After 6. And I have another one at 7 called 70s After 7. I'm going to let you guess what the one that's called at 8 o'clock. Yep. But then during the day, I call it workplace.live. And I'm just every hour, I'm restarting a playlist. And therefore, I know that at about 20 past the hour, I'm going to have one of my listeners pop on and say, hi, it's James from Manchester, and you're listening to radio.co. Go Radio. What's my station called? GoRadio.live. So it gives you the chance to, by breaking it up, it's not just more of the same all the time.
Absolutely. And I think that's kind of like a good approach to take as well. It doesn't always have to be one genre. You can go across, rather than different decades, you could have different genres at different times of the day, and just make sure that you're thinking about how you're splitting your playlists up. Okay. So, and also in terms of podcasting, how did you kind of initially come up with the concept for that? What was your approach to saying, right, okay, now is time to start a podcast? Because I know especially a lot of our radio customers are watching. We kind of sort of really much advising everyone to start a podcast. It's a great way of promoting your radio station. It's a good way of driving traffic to listeners to your station as well, and kind of creating kind of not necessarily just republishing shows that you've got broadcasting on air, but almost creating like supplementary content that kind of complements what you've got going out on your station.
Yeah, and I guess, as I said before, I've got a number of different podcasts going, and I've had a few that have failed dismally. But I think, like, for example, one of them is, in fact, repeated content from radio, not from GoRadio.live, but the stuff that we're doing on the local community station. Those interviews we just chop up and we have them as podcast episodes. Yeah. But the other podcasts, I think I started off with an idea that small businesses in Australia make up the vast majority of our economy. I think there's 2.1 million small businesses in a country that's got 25 million people living in it. So you can imagine that there's lots of them. And I tried to get a podcast around small business, talking to small business operators and saying to them, tell us about your business and tell us what you've learned as a business operator. It just didn't grab. And I tried to do it too much of a limited. That then sort of got this thing going in my head that says, you know what? The bit that was best was the bit where people said, I've learned this thing and I'm happy to share it, which is where the words of wisdom concept came in. And really good news, words of wisdom spells the word wow. And so so does War of Worlds, I'm told, which is what everyone assumes it's about. So WowPod was born out of that. I then also started to think a little bit more broadly, how can I then monetize this? And the best way to monetize it, in my mind, was to sell my services to a company. And so I started a concept called Home Buyers Q&A, where every episode was a question about buying a house. And I got a local real estate agent and a local mortgage broker and a local conveyancer and a local buyer's advocate to come and talk to me. Now, did I make $1 out of it? No, but that's okay. We gave it a crack. Yeah.
Did you? And what was the plan originally, to try and charge those companies for like airtime or podcast time, whatever you call it? Yeah.
So if you want to be on the conversation and give your clients the opportunity, if we're providing something for your clients, then maybe pay me a production cost or whatever. But we just didn't get it to that point.
Okay, cool. Right, just so before we move on to our next topic, if anyone's watching and has any questions for Neil or myself, please put them in the comments. We're going to be doing a Q&A at the end. It's always good to get some questions. So if you have any questions, if you think about starting a radio station, starting a podcast, or maybe you're already up and running, you got any questions, please put them in the comments. Right, so next up, you've made a decision. You want to start a podcast, you want to start a radio station. How do we go about actually planning that? How do we sort of kind of take an idea and then turn it into something that's got legs and has reality?
Well, I think I do a session that I run here called Start Your Own Podcast. It took me a while to come up with that name, obviously. Yeah. And I've got 3 components to it. What equipment do you need? What content do you need? And how do you host it? And I don't mean someone saying, hi, welcome to the show, not that sort of hosting, as in podcast.co type hosting. And I think looking at the equipment, that's pretty straightforward. And you can spend a couple of $100 Australian dollars, or you can spend 5,000 Australian dollars. And the more you spend, more often than not, the better the result. Yep. So that's pretty straightforward. You're going to tell me that there's only one podcast hosting solution, and that's podcast.co. There are a few others, but I've got to say I've tried 3 and I'm not going anywhere. Podcast.co is very much the one that I find the best, support-wise, cost-wise, flexibility-wise. All of those reasons is a reason. But content is where most of this falls over. People sit down and let's run a comparison. I've spent a bit of time in the corporate world, and people have the newsletter, and they have a competition the first week, and they say, let's come up with a really funky name for this newsletter. Yeah. And they call it James's Ideas, or one was called Tim's Tips, where I was working at one stage. And it works an absolute treat, the first episode or the first edition. It comes out, it's beautiful. Someone's won a pizza for the name. It works really, really well. Yep. And then the second 4 weeks later, that's the second Tuesday of every month, we put the newsletter out. It's not bad. The third time, we're starting to run out of ideas and content. And then by the fourth one, we're saying, look, we really shouldn't be doing it on the second Tuesday of the month because it's too quick. Let's do it every 6 weeks. And before long, after 5 editions, it's gone. Well, it's the same thing with the podcast. Think of it in the same context. And the great thing about WowPod, at the risk of pumping up WowPod, is all I need to do is find someone who's prepared to spend half an hour chatting to me, and there's my content. Yeah. Right. So, and when I was doing that, the one I spoke about with the business owners earlier, I had 16,000 business owners in my area. I've got 7.2 billion people I can ask to be on WowPod. So my content is endless if I choose to do that.
So in terms of planning, we've kind of got this concept of, thinking about what's going to happen in month 3, not just week number 1. And you basically, what you're saying is a lot of people will just think, oh, I've got a great idea for a podcast, or I've got a great idea for a newsletter or radio station.
Yep.
They'll then put everything out, which they've thought about, and then suddenly they're out of ideas. So just trying to kind of craft, what would you say, like an evergreen strategy, or just having a solid plan, which is going to be repeatable for a certain amount of time?
Well, I think one distinction I like to make in podcasting is what I call conversational versus presentation.
Yes. Okay.
So if you're a financial manager or, an expert in, real estate, I guess you can present your concept and there's going to be an endless supply of conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're talking about something that's quite limited, like Australian rules football, I'm going to do an episode for each of the AFL clubs. After 18 weeks, I'm done. I've got nothing to talk about. So it's about having something, as you say, that's evergreen in its style. The great thing about conversational is we're having this conversation now. We're going to spend 15 to 30 minutes, whatever it is, chatting.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know what I'm going to say in the next 15 minutes. I don't know what you're going to say in the next 15 minutes. There is this concept of unpredictability, which most people enjoy listening to. Mm-hmm. And again, we could come back this time next week and chat about something else. There is this and that's where conversation, I think, works better in some respects than the presentation style.
So what advice would you give to someone who's looking, because you're right, I think conversation is great. What would you say to someone who wants to start a podcast for a specific business? Like, let's say I've got an accountancy firm, right? Mm-hmm. You might think that's really boring. How do I then apply this kind of conversational idea to something that's kind of, quite specific in its topic versus just, obviously with WowPod, you ask people to bring 3 words of wisdom, isn't it? It's 3. That's right. Yeah.
More than 3 and less than 5.
Right. Okay. So 3 to 5 words of wisdom, which is kind of, that could be anything, right? Yeah. But if I've got something really specific, how would I apply this kind of theme to a podcast about a specific topic?
Well, I think it's a bit cart before the horse. Rather than saying, I want to have a podcast, what am I going to talk about? It's more about saying, what do I want to talk about? Do I have a podcast?
Yes.
Because if, and I know nothing about accounting, just ask my accountant.
No.
I'm assuming that you could spend, in Australia, the financial year starts on the 1st of July. You could spend if you're doing a weekly podcast, for example, the last 4 weeks of June, you could say, right, preparing for your tax. Yep. And the first 4 weeks of July, getting your tax return done or whatever it happens to be. So having a structure, it doesn't mean having a script. It doesn't mean necessarily saying, I know who my guest is going to be on the 17th of February 2021. But it is about saying, I know what the broad structure is. If you think about it, for example, if it's an interesting idea that's just coming to my head. If you're a church, you can say that, 3 weeks after Easter, that's what we talk about in the service. There's almost like a curriculum. And I guess that's kind of where my brain's going to.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So think about key points, key happenings, and look at your schedule as a business. What information are you normally telling your customers? And, this is, again, something that we always say is, like, if you're already sending stuff out as an email newsletter, you could easily turn that into a podcast. And actually just having, 2 colleagues sat in a room discussing it is sometimes more interesting and more natural and more valuable to clients than actually writing stuff down, which can kind of easily just go unread. And likewise as well, I think there's a benefit to doing podcasts versus video, because it feels a lot more. Sometimes when you put a camera in someone's face, immediately they're kind of like, not everyone. Some people like being in front of a camera, but there's a lot of people that don't. And I think podcasting can sometimes be a more natural way of communication, because you can literally just record a conversation that would have happened otherwise anyway, right?
Well, my Two Blokes Chatting podcast was exactly that. Yeah. My mate Rob and I used to, on a Thursday night, we used to ring each other to talk about what we were going to do on Saturday when we were broadcasting the game of football. I said, we record this and stick it out as a podcast.
Yeah.
And that Two Blokes Chatting started. It was 2 blokes and we were chatting. So we thought, gee, I know what we could call it, 2 Blokes Chatting. Yeah. And so whilst there was no great structure to it, we knew that on a Thursday night, we would come along, we would talk about who was playing and who wasn't playing and who we thought was going to win and all that kind of stuff. Again, not prescriptive by any means, but if it was stuff we were going to be talking about anyway, it reminds me, I went to a conference, one of those dreadful sales conferences that you're forced to go to every now and again when you're in some sales-related organisation, as I was, and you get the senior manager stands up and does the opening address, and then someone gets up and talks about the price of whatever they're selling, and everyone loses interest. One of the best things I saw them do at the organisation I've just been doing some work with was every time a presentation was done, 2 people got up.
Right.
And they effectively had a conversation that 500 people were listening to on the topic concerned. And that's where the conversational podcast concept comes in as well.
Very similar to like the concept of a fireside chat. I know if that's a bit of a buzzword, I think, nowadays, but I think it's just much more interesting watching a conversation on stage than it is, say someone with a dry PowerPoint behind them, just kind of clicking next, like that's on autopilot. Yeah. Okay. So to move on then. So once you've got your concept determined and you've thought about what topics you're going to be talking about, you've got to make sure that, actually, well, this thing's got to have legs in 6 months' time or a year's time, not just the first couple of weeks. How do we then actually launch a podcast or radio station? How do we get people listening to our content? And, can we sort of talk through some marketing strategies? I know obviously with Go Radio, you're focused on a local audience. WowPod is a bit more broad, I guess. So what sort of marketing tactics have you employed to kind of get your concepts off the ground and get people tuned in?
Yeah, well, I think the first question you've got to answer is why you're doing it. And if you're doing it, as I've got to say from my radio station to start with, was because I'm self-indulgent and want to have a radio station of my own. If that's the answer, then that's fine. You don't need to market it. It's going to cost you a bit, but at the end of the day, if you're doing it because you enjoy doing it, fine.
Yeah.
But I've had people come to me talk about their podcast idea, and they say, "So who do you think is going to listen to it?" And I say, "Well, if you can't tell me who's going to be listening to it, you've got no idea. I mean, you've got to understand why you're doing it and who you're doing it for. Who is going to listen to it?" I think the other thing people fall into a bit of a hole with is they say, I'm going to do it about investment advice. You go, great. And you're going to be one of 5 million podcasts about investment advice. What makes you different? I have an analogy that is very Australian. We had a car called the Commodore up until General Motors decided to kill off our brand called Holden. And my analogy is, if you go into a car yard and you say, I want to buy a white Commodore, car dealer says, come with me. And he takes you out the back and there's 10,000 white Commodores to buy.
Yeah.
Why would I buy the one in the front row 3 from the left as distinct from the one in the back row 7 from the right? Because it's got less Ks on the clock, the tyres are better, the registration is paid up. There will be a reason why I choose one as distinct from the other. Well, it's a bit the same with podcasting or radio stations.
Yeah.
Why would I listen to you when I could listen to any one of 15,000 other podcasts? So you've got to have a really clear understanding of what you're competing with. Now, with GoRadio.live, as I said, the music we play is the music primarily from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And every capital city and every regional area has got a station that does that. What makes us different? We tend to also play album tracks. If you hear American Pie by Don McLean, you're not going to get the 3-minute commercial radio version. You're going to get the full 8 minutes, 11 seconds. So they're the sorts of things that we do differently. And I've pretty much used the standard kind of marketing approach, which is tell your friends, tell your family, stick it on social media and start watching it grow. And I've been fortunate, if that's an unfortunate thing to say, I guess, in the context of coronavirus, because people have been stuck at home, I've been doing what I've called a virtual school reunion. And I've got people doing shout outs to their old schoolmates that they would normally do at a proper school reunion on the radio. So, it's just coming up with an idea that makes yours different is part of that strategy.
That's quite clever. I quite like that. So let me just so let's sort of discuss that in a bit more detail. So the idea of doing a school reunion, I see what you're saying. Yes, tell your friends, tell your family. It's always a good place to start with anything. Whenever you're bringing in, if you're launching a new project or a website, or you're starting something in your local community, just kind of get people talking about it. But what I think is clever about that is, if someone's getting a shout out on a station for the school friends, they're going to tell their friends about it as well. And naturally you're going to get that kind of viral snowball effect, because one person will sort of put it on their Facebook page, so that 1,000 people or whoever might discover that, and then one of those people might pick it up, and if they can think, oh, I can do the same, I'll do a shout out, and you can grow wider and wider and wider just from starting by kind of getting. So it's really about actual audience engagement and relying on your audience to tell other people about your station then.
And it comes back to this question of why would I listen to GoRadio.live when I can listen to 104.3 Gold up the road?
Yes.
Well, the reason is because they don't do request programs for our school.
No.
And, I'm fortunate the school that I was in was only around for 25 years. Once they got rid of me, they said, no, we don't want any more of that. So they closed it down. And so we've got a really quite a distinct group of people. But once we're getting to the end of the lockdown, which unfortunately in Melbourne today, they're doing again, what we've now turned that into as of the 7th of August is going to be the Friday night request show. Now, I've already got 200 or 300 people who are listening to it because of the high school. Well, they can then tell their friends, hey, actually, I'm going to do a shout out for you now. So it's that growth thing. I think the expectation that you'll start a podcast and look at it in 3 weeks' time and go, look, I've got 5,000 listeners is unrealistic. And I think the same with the radio station. I can see, because I use radio.co, how many people are listening at any given time. And I can also look back in history and see that over the last month or two. So you can see it growing. My measure on growth is the number of streams. That is, if I play a song and 6 people listen to it, that's considered as 6 streams in the licensing rules. I'm seeing a steady growth, and I'm not getting big numbers. I'm getting maybe 15,000 streams across a 3-month period, but it's then 16,000, and then it's 17,000, and now it's 20,000. It's just gradually starting to grow in a way that if it was going the other way, I'd be a bit concerned, I suspect. Yeah. And how about with Words of Wisdom? What's been your approach to marketing that? Because I think, there's different ways you can focus on growing a radio station versus a podcast as well. Again, I think if you're launching a podcast as part of an existing marketing strategy, it's just almost like an extension to what you're already doing. So I think always starting with your existing customer base, your existing audience, making sure that they're aware of it's a good place to go. But I guess with Words of Wisdom, you've got the added benefit of the fact that you've got so many different people coming through your door, so to speak, to be engaging on each episode, and they're going to be sharing it with their audiences as well, right? Yeah, and I'm using a product called Content Pilot, which enables you to schedule social media posts. I mean, different to Hootsuite or any of the other ones, but that's the one I happen to be using. Yeah. And so what I'm doing is when I finish recording an episode, I put a post onto my WordPress site, which I've got, which has the podcast.co player, but also a subscribe button on it. Yes. And so you can either, if it's your episode they want to listen to, they can go and grab that without having to go through the whole subscribe process. But then what I've also then do is put a social media post in, and more often than not, you tag the person in it, and they tell their friends, and before long, you've got the next group of people. So social media plays a really important part. But if you're going to, whenever I release an episode, I release one at Monday, 10 a.m. and Wednesday, 10 a.m. And Friday at 10 a.m., a post comes up and do Flashback Friday, which says, don't forget, we also did all these episodes in the past. So it's this continual content on social media that's going to get it to grow, I suspect, as well. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, if anyone's got any questions for Neil or myself, please put them in the comments. We've got our first few questions in now. So let's kick things off. Questions about streaming such as this, like on YouTube, Facebook Live, etc. It feels a lot like radio in that it's live. You can listen to it in the background, and it's a regular program scheduled at a fixed time of the day. E.g., we do this every single Wednesday at 1 p.m. How does it compare to a radio show? This is from Salman. Well, for starters, you can see how handsome we are. In my case, not terribly. I think the advantage of the radio is if we were doing this for an hour every Wednesday, that's great. And I do a program on a radio station between 9 and 11 every Saturday. But the great thing about a podcast is if I can't make it between 9 and 11 on Saturday morning, I can come back to it later. That's the huge advantage you've got with podcasting. I noticed that Rick has come on and said, is this being recorded to watch late? I turned up late. Yes, exactly. Right. So I think that's where your podcasting has the advantage over a radio station. How different is this to radio? You can't do this while you're driving a car. That's true. I think also one of the points I was going to make on that is it's very similar to radio.
we choose to do these interviews on a variety of different platforms because there's already audiences there. So, for example, one of the platforms that we're going out on is LinkedIn. LinkedIn, having live streams on LinkedIn is still quite a new thing. So you do tend to get more people being notified that you're actually live, and you can attract a bigger audience organically. But yeah, one of the things we didn't do is series 1 of Working Lunch, which finished about a month and a half, 2 months ago. So I ran it from February till middle of May, had a little break, and then this is episode number 1 of season 2. And we'll probably run this, again for the next few months, probably through till September time, something like that. It's good to have a break from these things every now and again, but it's good to be consistent as well. Make sure your audience are aware of exactly when it's going to happen. One of the great things about this particular format is it's not always focused on radio and podcasting. Sometimes we talk about marketing. We've talked about sort of HR, recruitment, all sorts of things. So again, it's having that format that's flexible. But one of the things which we missed out on season 1 is actually just turning it into a normal podcast. So we've said from this episode, we're going to be converting each one just to audio only format, putting it out on all the podcast platforms. Again, it's about cross-purposing content. It's about taking something that you've recorded, like you said before, yes, people can watch it again. It'll be available to watch again on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, but then also we can now turn this into audio. And yet one of the other things that we do is take out the juicy bits, like the kind of the aha moments, words of wisdom, and repurpose that for things like Instagram or Twitter, so you can have those kind of short form bits of video, which is really, really good. And again, it's a great way of taking content that you're spending time producing and trying to squeeze as much value and push it as far as you can.
Yeah, the reuse is a really important part of it.
Yeah. Okay. What is the hardest part of starting an online radio station? This comes from Alexander.
Hello, Alexander. I know Alexander. He was WowPod number 30-something.
Really?
Yeah. He's a young fella in Pendleton, Oregon, 14 years of age and setting up his own radio station.
Perfect.
I think the content is the really difficult bit. And Alexander and I have had this conversation offline. I've got 2,500 songs in my music library. Now, apart from the fact you've got to own them, you've got to have the licensing and all that kind of stuff, just the uploading of them. Yeah. There was nothing more frustrating than sitting uploading 2,500 songs, having converted them from M4A into MP3 because that takes up less space and therefore can use the library better. But just sitting there and thinking, great, that's 72 songs I've uploaded. I've got 2,500. I'm going to be here forever. And you just want to start. Yeah. So now that's a music station. If you're talking about content that's not music, so this sort of stuff that we're doing, or the program, the Two Blokes Chatting type stuff, just having the equipment, thinking about the equipment that you need, being able to save the money if you're not doing all that well financially, to buy better equipment than you otherwise might have. I think there are a couple of things to factor into your thinking.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting because I ran a radio project here in Manchester called MCR Live. And you're right, the actual maintenance, the just kind of keeping on top of your music library takes a lot of time. And because, you want to not only be, have enough selection so it's not just too repetitive, but then it's actually updating it every single month. Like, if you want to be kind of fresh, because otherwise people do hear this, if you've got people are listening month in, month out, even if you've got 2,000 or 3,000 tracks, you do end up hearing the same stuff coming up again and again. So it's good to sort of be refreshing those playlists as much as you can. And certainly with MCR Live, we were kind of on the cutting edge of what was being released. So every month we'd be having to pay attention to, which bands that we wanted to promote. Some of them which weren't necessarily very well known, but they might be up and coming. And again, we had a great girl called Jess who worked on that. She was kind of like music controller. So she was really tasked with that. And again, we'd be looking at things like, which bands would be in town doing gigs that month, and if there was a town, a band coming through town, we make sure that we were featuring them on the playlist. So it's really you've really got to be on top of the music, and again, I think this is one of the benefits to creating a station versus what you look at what a lot of commercial stations are doing now. If you listen to, certainly here in the UK, it's really boring listening to most commercial radio stations because their playlists have just got smaller and smaller and smaller. And even the ones that play sort of slightly alternative genres, they still have very small playlists. So they might say like they play 90s music or 80s, but they'll still play the same set of tracks from the 80s and 90s. And there's tons of stuff that they could play, but they just don't seem to. And it's really frustrating. So I think, actually that's one thing. That's one way you can actually use to stand out as a radio station when you're crafting your own project, versus just kind of following the norm of what's happened, where, to say, a lot of stations have been absorbed into these big corporates, so they have kind of lost their individualism, I think.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's really good about the genre I have is there's not a lot of 60s, 70s, and 80s music coming out at the moment, but one of the best tools I've got is Shazam. Yeah. So I'll be in a shop and I hear a song I haven't heard for 30 years. I just Shazam it, not because I don't know what the song is, but I've got an automatic record of what to go home and buy and put into the station. So it's growing, but not at the same rate as obviously something that's really contemporary.
Yeah, I agree. And interestingly, Shazam is one of these tools that I've used for years and years. I actually used to use it before the days of smartphones, and you actually used to have to dial up a phone number. It was 2580 here in the UK, and it would answer, and then it would text you back with what song it thought it was. Okay. So it's amazing, because even that was kind of cutting edge at the time, and now of course it's really good. It is a good tool for music discovery. I completely agree. I always get stick from my friends because I'll be in a restaurant or something trying to, with loads of background noise, and you're trying to get going up to the speaker so you can get a clear sort of
speaker. Yeah.
And everyone's like looking at you like, what are you doing stood up there? Just trying to, Anyway, that's happened a few times. Cool. Okay. A couple more questions.
It's the record. It was WowPod 32. He tells me.
Can a life coaching podcast be monetized? This is from Rahul. Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, I think you again need to look at your audience and try and sort of think about potential sponsors. What's your take on that, Neil?
Well, I think there's a few ways you can monetize something. One is you can go, as I've done with one of my other podcasts, and you can actually go and effectively present it on behalf of them. So you're effectively being paid as a performer, if you like. So that's one way you can monetize. Another one is using your PayPal, your Patreons, these sort of things that say, just if I'd just like to spend $5 a month to keep WowPod going, or whatever it happens to be. But with the other way of doing it is, as you say, to go and get a sponsor. So the Home Buyers Q&A one that we did, we got a sponsorship from one of those businesses to say, we'll pay you $500 a month or whatever it was. And that's your traditional sponsor of a radio station kind of model. So there's lots of ways to do it. I guess the question that I would I have in the back of my mind for something like life coaching, I would have thought, and this is just a complete novice in the world of life coaching, is the stuff you're going to be talking about too specific to an individual, and therefore is it going to have the broader appeal, and therefore is it going to have the appeal in terms of sponsorship and so on?
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I think you make some good points there. I think there's different ways of monetizing podcasts. There's different ways of monetizing radio stations. It doesn't always have to just be what you traditionally imagine to be like sort of 30-second advert spots, which play every 15 minutes. But also you need to just think about your audience, and part of it's going to be the sales process as well. You need to convince and prove to whoever might be sponsoring your radio station or your podcast that, number one, you've got an audience, even if it's not massive. It doesn't have to be like tens of millions of people listening, but what you need to do is prove that audience is relevant and engaged. If you've got a radio station that's sort of playing, say, like gold music, like you said, sort of 70s, 80s, 60s stuff, think about what sort of products, services that audience might be, and what age group are they? And if you can kind of demonstrate that those sort of figures to your potential sponsors, that's the way forward.
Yeah, and getting a sponsor that's relevant. When I had a program at a previous radio station, everything was 60s, 70s, 80s. Radio Gaga was the name of that program, and I went up to the local recycle record shop and got them to sponsor it, because an ideal match. Going and getting a car dealer, what's the link? There is no link.
Yeah, I think so. If you've got music enthusiasts and you can prove that, yes, these people listening are music enthusiasts, perfect. Record stop. Maybe someone even selling like memorabilia, that kind of thing. You have to try and be creative and think about, what your audience actually want. Because ultimately that's going to deliver better results for your audience listening. They're going to be more engaged with the adverts and more likely to take action, plus also a better fit for the people who are putting money your way.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, this is a good question. I'm looking to start a radio show here in Nairobi. From my observation, the Kenyan audience retention rate online is quite low. So once I start, should I limit the show to a shorter time? And how do I keep the audience hooked throughout the show?
Well, the fact that we've still got him on board from 40 minutes is a good sign that we've got him hooked.
That's true.
I guess it's no different to any other form. If you're writing a book, I just was reading a book while I was waiting for this to start, and I'm up to chapter 7, and I'm in. I'm now committed to it. So the content needs to be engaging, and I think this is where the question is that talks about who's my audience. Because, for example, the Home Buyers Q&A podcasting, there's no point me doing that, expecting my audience to be, 55-year-old people who've bought 7 houses. I'm talking really at those first home buyers. So knowing what your audience is means you can then tailor your content. I think one of the big mistakes people make is they say, and it doesn't matter what you're selling, whether it's a radio station or a block of chocolate, I want everybody in the world to buy my product.
Yep.
Well, clearly, GoRadio.live, for example, absolutely no likelihood of anyone under the age of 30 going to listen to it, right? But that's okay. That's what I've chosen to do. I want to play music that people who are between, say, 40 and 70 really enjoy. So rather than trying to be all things to all people, try and understand who's going to listen, and then what is it about that group that makes your product attractive. And that could be a radio station, as I said, a block of chocolate, or a car.
Yeah. I think I completely agree. You'd be amazed the amount of people that come to us and literally assume that the whole world's going to listen to them. It's quite common, actually, and this is great. You can't knock people for trying, but actually that's not the reality of the situation. You've got to try and focus. On the internet, it's a huge place. There's so many people online, but if you can actually focus on your niche or your genre and get that right, really kind of nail the corner of it. And we've got some great case studies of stations that have managed to do that on radio.co, and fantastic podcasts that have managed to do that, and there's no harm in sort of going and listening to those guys. You find out what is the competition and what are they doing, and what is their marketing strategy. Again, the cool thing I always think about music, which I don't see enough stations doing, is just having more content strategy around it. What were the top 10 singles in July 1979 or whatever. There's so much stuff that you can write about, generate kind of written content, which will then help drive traffic to your audio content. And which, again, I see sort of it's a simple thing to do. Does require a bit of time and a bit of legwork, but a lot of stations don't seem to do that, which I think is a shame. Okay, just to kind of wrap up then, how about this one here? Solomon asks, what sort of is your live setup? What tools do you use? Do you want to run through your setup, Neil? What kind of equipment do you use for your podcast and your station?
So fortunately, the podcast and the radio station both use the same kit. With the only exception being that podcast I'm recording onto something, whereas whenever I'm doing radio, whether it's live or whether it's the scheduled stuff that I do through radio.co, I use the same equipment, except obviously I'm broadcasting out through the internet. So I'm sitting in my studio as we speak. To my left, I have what's called a Rode Procaster. Rodecaster Pro. One of the most silly decisions ever made by a company was to call their microphone the Procaster and to call their desk a Rodecaster. But anyway, putting it aside, the Rodecaster is a 4-channel XLR desk. It also has Bluetooth input. It has TRRS input, which means I can link a phone into it. It's got USB input. It looks a lot like that. Yeah. I do like that one. Disconnect everything.
This one actually hasn't. I actually don't use this as primary. I've not gone quiet, have I? No. It's so this was. I was doing some videos with it recently, but they are a fantastic bit of kit, and it's only been around for like a year or two, and it's one of those things that I wish that there was something like this 10, 15 years ago when I first started broadcasting, because it didn't. This is a brand new device, but it's fantastic.
And Rode is an Australian company. We're going to get that in. And the fellow who set up Rode the other day bought, who was it? It was Kurt Cobain's guitar for $6 million US. So he's obviously done reasonably well for himself. I have 2 microphones. I've chosen to use Rode products again because they're Australian, but also because they interact really well with the desk. I have a Rode Procaster, which is the microphone I normally use, and I have a Rode Pod mic on the other side of the desk. Beyond that, don't skimp on headphones. The headphones I use are Audio Technica, and the Audio Technica, 250 Australian dollars or thereabouts, but they're really good and they're really light. If you're doing radio, you don't want to be sitting there with something that's 10 times the weight of your own body sitting on the top of your head.
Like these.
It starts to get really heavy after a while.
Yeah.
All of my music is on my my MacBook Pro. I have another MacBook Pro that's effectively one's the input and the other one's the output effectively.
Yeah.
So, and the webcam, I've just bought the webcam, and I thought it would make me look more handsome than I am, but clearly that's not the case. I'm using a Logitech Streamcam. They're about 200 Australian dollars again.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, again, for this, I'm just using my built-in, the built-in webcam on my iMac, which isn't fantastic, but for these kind of live broadcasts, it's fine. It doesn't have to be perfect. I think again, it's just about making the most of what you can afford. Making sure, for example, like lighting is always important. Just try and either use daylight or try and get some lighting if you can when you're doing video. It makes a big difference.
I was going to use daylight today, but it was a little bit late to do it.
It is, yeah. And I think, going out and spending, so for example, the Rode Pod mic you've just given as an example, that's $100, right? I know that's sometimes if you're just getting started, it might seem like a lot of money, but just investing in that versus using a built-in microphone will just make so much difference. It'll make you sound 10 times better. And ultimately, you need to bear in mind, listeners will get fatigued if it's too echoey or if there's too much background noise or if you're too quiet, So just make sure you've got, at least a sort of decent USB mic, because you can pick them up for under $50 now, I think.
Well, I'm going to try and experiment. This could fail dismally.
You've just gone quiet now. This is just silent.
I was hoping to, I disconnected I've got a lapel mic on as well. I was hoping that would kick into my other echoey kind of laptop microphone, but it didn't work. Yeah. Sorry. It was worth a try.
No, worth a try. But yeah, I think, again, clip on lapel mic, pretty inexpensive, right?
Yeah, I think 60 or 70 Australian dollars, 35, 40 US, whatever that translates to in your money.
Cool. Okay. Well, Neil, I think that's all we've got time for today. Thank you very much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here. And I think we've covered off some really interesting stuff.
Yeah. And if anyone has got anything that they want to take further, send me an email, neil@untypical.com.au. So neil@untypical.com.au. Just make sure that you explain that you saw me on Working Lunch, so I know where the link comes from, and then I'll get back to you with an email at some stage.
Won't get too freaked out. And then also, Neil, if someone wants to check out your radio station, your podcast, how can they do so?
Well, the best bet is for WowPod, just go to wowpod.com.au. Unfortunately, GoRadio.live, because of the licensing restrictions, you can go and have a look at the website at www.goradio.live. But unfortunately, it's geo-blocked to Australia, so you won't be able to listen to it outside of Australia at the moment. But hopefully one day we'll be able to extend across the world. But untypical.com.au is where everything I do is located, and that's got links to the podcasts and station in there as well.
All right, Neil. Thank you very much. Been a pleasure.
Thanks everybody. See you next time.
See you later.